And welcome to the next webinar in a series being presented by the Electricity Sector Climate Information or ESCI project. For those who haven't been exposed to the project, the ESCI project is funded through the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources and is undertaken by CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology in conjunction with the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO. My name is Rebecca Gregory and I'm the CSIRO project manager for this project. Before we get started, I just need to mention a few housekeeping items. As you can see, you've all been muted and have your videos turned off. This is just to reduce the feedback and distractions for the presenter. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, we'll answer those, but we also encourage you today to ask questions directly in the Q&A session. So if you would like to speak, put an exclamation mark only in the chat and we'll call you out to ask the question. Today's webinar is entitled Scenarios, Pathways, Projections and Stress Tests, some key concepts of future climate analysis and is being presented by Michael Gross from CSIRO. Michael's a research scientist working on regional climate change processes, attribution and projections. He has a strong interest in climate research and communication on topics with impact. Michael recently presented at the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements and is a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So now I'm going to hand it over to Michael to start the presentation.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks very much for everyone coming along. So hopefully this presentation is going to be interesting and fun, kind of look at the big picture of what we do when we look at future and future climate and some of the key concepts. And then towards the end, we're going to get into what the terminology used and how it's been used and how perhaps we should be more clear on some of the concepts and terms, and also how we need to harmonise or at least make our terminology comparable between different areas who use the same words in different ways. But first of all, starting with the big picture, before looking at the future, well, how do we understand and look at the current and past climate? Well, we use our observations and models of the past climate, bring those together to get a look at how the climate has varied and has changed through time. There's also an important area of research on attribution of past trends, that is working out what was the cause of a past trend or a recent event and how much you can attribute a certain cause to it. There's also a concept of nowcasting of the current climate. That's looking at the sequence of events leading up to the current moment and what state the system is in and therefore what trajectory it's on. And that's an important part in of course, weather forecasting, seasonal forecasting and so on, is to getting a good picture of actually what the current is like. There's also just having a close look at the impact of past climate events as they happened and analysing their impact. And that's important for our understanding of what the climate means for us on the ground. There's also the idea of understanding where there's near misses, when an extreme event happened and it didn't have an impact, but it almost did. And that's an important concept for understanding climate risk and climate risk management. There's also a concept of understanding counterfactual examples, when an event had it played out slightly differently with a different timing, different extent and so on, what would have been the effect? Because there's a potential space of events and any one event plays out within that space, but it's important to understand our risk across the entire space of possibilities. There's also a really interesting and fairly new field called event attribution, which is looking at how an event played out, an extreme event, compared to a world without human influence, kind of a counterfactual world if you didn't have greenhouse gases, didn't have human influence on the climate. And the diagrams on the right here just show kind of a traditional form of attribution of mean annual temperature change. When you model it without greenhouse gases, you get the blue line. You model it with greenhouse gases, you get the red line, and that matches observations. So that's one line of evidence to kind of point you towards the fact that greenhouse gases are the predominant contributor to the global temperature rise we've seen in the last 50 or 60 years. And the one at the bottom is an example of an event attribution study looking at the event as it happened. This is an extreme heat event in the Arctic in 2016. And on the right, you can see how the event would have played out with only natural influences on the climate, and you get very much a reduction in that heat extreme. And then how it played out modelled including human influences, and you can match the event quite closely. So that's an example of a counterfactual world and a real world of that event. when it comes to looking at the future, well, what have people done through history? What are our kind of preconceptions and our biases about looking at the future and what could happen? For a lot of us, our kind of unspoken, subconscious bias is, well, things will continue as they are, assumption of no change. Or in weather forecasting, this is known as a persistence forecast. Things are the same as they were yesterday. But we know that that's not always reliable. There's also a kind of a bias we have towards thinking that, well, the future is mysterious, unknowable. It's kind of arrogant for us to think that we can predict the future or look into it and know with any certainty. That's kind of a very deep kind of feeling I think people generally have. Then there's kind of rules of thumb people just generally tend to take when they think about the future. Oh, let's hope for the best, but let's prepare for the worst. These kind of phrases are thrown around. Traditionally, humans have done things like prophecies, superstitions, revealed truths, and this is still a prevalent thing in many places in the world, including in Australia, and is something to be conscious of, that this is still a very valued thing for a lot of people. And as an example, the plot on the right shows one poll from a Yale Center for Climate Change Communication, where they surveyed US citizens, and according to that poll, 11% of Americans think that the prophesied end times are coming, therefore don't need to worry about global warming. So that attitude will be shaping their views about climate projections and managing climate risk very strongly, of course. Another concept is, well, let's just look at what happened in the past and let's extrapolate forward. This can be a good guide in certain circumstances, but in sometimes is a very bad guide and can be very risky. And the approach that perhaps us in climate research are most familiar with are science and evidence-based prediction and projections, and this is what we put our greatest stock in. But it's important to put that in the context of what else is out there in terms of our attitudes and our general practices. So what's the difference between a prediction and a projection? So a prediction is a forecast of the exact sequence of events or the probabilities of those events in a future period. Generally, it exploits the predictability that's in the climate system from its initial state and its recent past. So as you see a El Nino event building, for example, you can see how that will then play out over the coming months to get a prediction of what it will be like next month, in 2 months' time, etc., to make a seasonal forecast. It assumes that our boundary conditions, or say, for example, the greenhouse gas concentrations that we've got are on a set pathway, and it's more about kind of getting that predictability from the initial state going forwards. So it's kind of called a initial state problem in kind of maths terms. Projections, or climate projections and other types of projections, are generally about a view of how the mean state or average state and the statistics of the climate are changing through time. And it shows the effect of the change in the boundary conditions. So for example, the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And projections are generally not so tied and using the predictability from the initial state. And another really important about projections is they are typically used to show different trajectories of those boundary conditions into the future. So in the greenhouse gases point of view, different scenarios of greenhouse gas changes in the atmosphere going forward. And this little animation is kind of showing Australian mean annual temperature up until kind of recently. And the red line would be a prediction of exactly what would happen if we could make it, and which years would be hot, which years would be cool. Whereas a projection is more about, well, what's the window that variable is operating in, and then where could it go under different pathways into the future. So I hope that's clear. But what about the term scenarios, and how is that used generally and in climate applications? So this is a little decision tree from the study cited at the bottom, and I think it's useful to kind of work out what you're talking about is a scenario or not. So first condition is it's about the future. If it's not about the future, it might be a nowcast or a counterfactual example. Is it about the external context? If not, it's more likely to be an option evaluation, management dilemma, etc., about what you're going to do internal decision-wise. Importantly, does it include a narrative description? If not, it's more like it's extrapolation, sensitivity analysis, etc. Are each of those narratives plausibly possible? If no, science fiction? Is it a systemized set of plausibly possible narratives? No, then it's more like a prediction or a what-if scenario, etc. It's not comprehensive or systematized. And are the different scenarios comparatively different? No, then it's kind of something else. But if it meets all those criteria, then it's considered a scenario or set of scenarios. So what they are long-term strategic planning methods that consider alternative possible outcomes or alternative worlds, but importantly about the external context, including narrative descriptions, a set of plausibly possible cases, and are systematized, for example, a representative sampling of the possibilities that are out there. When you're describing what a scenario is, the time window is important. If you're talking about what could happen in a short time window, like an event or a sequence of events, then this can be considered a scenario, but this term is often also used alternatively with a case study or even a stress test scenario if those events are particularly challenging. They're kind of a sequence of events designed to test the system. Scenarios can be about a long time window, which means, what is a scenario of the change in the mean state and statistics of the climate or whatever system. However, confusingly, this can also be considered a stress test if that change in the conditions is considered stressing. And scenarios can be of either time window or a sample of each. So for example, here's an example of banking stress tests from the Bank of England. They label these two different types of stress test scenarios. Scenario 1 is a short time window economic shock. Scenario 2 is long-term challenges. So yeah, that's kind of depends on in what context it's used, whether you say scenario, whether you say stress test scenario, whether you say stress test. So this is where some of these confusions can come in. In terms of climate, there's two important classifications of scenarios that are generally termed. One is scenarios of how you get the climate change, the so-called climate forcing or inputs into the climate change. So global emissions or pathways of greenhouse gases, aerosol, land use change, etc., driving climate change. And this can include a socioeconomic dimension or just emissions kind of the forcing dimension. And the latest couple of sets of these used internationally, RCPs and SSPs, we'll get to those soon. There is another important type of scenario used in climate change and climate risk kind of circles, which is scenario of actually what climate change could occur in the future. So these are kind of physical climate change scenarios. So a set of scenarios of changes in averages and extremes, or otherwise phrased as chronic and acute hazards, presented actually as a set of scenarios with narratives behind them. But it's important to note that future climate information is usually given as just projections for a given emission scenario, not the second one, not physical climate change scenarios. So let's go first of all through that first category, the emissions pathways or the scenarios of how you get climate change. This typically done in Australia and around the world using agreed internationally developed schemes. There was the IPCC set of scenarios IS92 released in 1992. Then the Special Report on Emission Scenarios, SRES, in 2001, which was used commonly until about 2010 or so. And then in 2011, and then for the fifth assessment report of the IPCC in 2013-14, there was the RCPs, Representative Concentration Pathways. In development now and starting to be taken up are the shared socioeconomic pathways, which incorporate a dimension of the representative concentration pathways, the greenhouse gases and forcings, but also include a socioeconomic dimension to them. This plot on the right is quite complicated, but I'll talk you through it briefly. So this is a plot I grabbed off the web from the authors listed at the bottom there, including Glenn Peters. And this is a comparison of total CO2 emissions as an important component of emission scenarios, not the only one, but an important component of it. And this has shown our historical observed emissions. And here's how these various scenarios, schemes from the past are presented on top of that. And you can see the IS 92 scenario starting in 1992 and spreading outwards as the blue dotted lines. Then the SRES scenarios in green dashed lines, starting in about year 2000 and spreading out forwards. Then the RCPs as well. And you can see they've had some similarities over time. They've got different starting points, but they all include a high and a low and a medium kind of set of scenarios. And you can see that observations typically have been tracking in the middle to upper range of any set after they'd started. So compared to the RCPs, the coloured lines, we were for a while in terms of CO2 emissions tracking above it, above the highest, and are now kind of just dipping below the level of the highest. That doesn't mean that we'll keep following any particular one into the future. We can obviously change course and through time at any point. And so it's still considered possible to get down to near the low one in the future. So the new scheme that's coming through the pipeline is the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, or SSPs. And this includes a greenhouse gas enhancement level, the representative concentration pathway, if you like, kind of dimension on the vertical from very low to very high, based on the number. And then across the top is the global shared socioeconomic pathway that can get you to one or more of those levels. So this is kind of sets up a matrix, and a lot of the combinations in there are possible, but not all of them are. Some SSPs just simply can't get you to some levels of RCP, or the other way around. Some RCPs are just not compatible with some SSPs, and they've given a narrative storyline to each of these 5, from sustainability through middle of the road, regional rivalry, inequality and fossil fuel development. And they've also got quantitative information behind that about population, technology change, and then of course, greenhouse gas emissions and land use change and so on. The squares marked in dark blue will be the highest priority combinations for climate modelers to tackle, and then the light blue, the second level priority for climate modelers to tackle. But there will be, of course, be work and looking at some of these rarer combinations of the white boxes as well, which might be of interest to some questions. So that's the input scenarios, the kind of emissions pathways or RCPs, SSPs, etc. That's one use of the term scenarios. I mentioned that you can actually make real physical climate change scenarios with narratives to them. And has anyone done that? Well, the first stage to that might be to combine SSPs, RCPs, add a national kind of overlay or viewpoint to that, and then come up with a set of the context scenarios for the country. This has been attempted for New Zealand by this study, where they looked at the RCPs, looked at the SSPs, looked at the projections from global models, regional models, synthesized all that, and they kind of proposed 6 national scenarios for New Zealand. And these were given the names you can see there. All of this kind of seems, this exercise seems to be coming up with very catchy names, and I think they did that there. And this assumes a certain combination of the global SSP RCP, but then adds local information to it. But that's still just the kind of context, or the input scenarios. These aren't physical climate change scenarios. We'll get there is an example of that in a moment. Actually, no, I'll switch to that now. So yeah, there is a case where some nations have attempted to actually produce physical climate scenarios. This is an example from the Netherlands, where they presented information for the future of their nation in a set of 4 pathways, so four combinations here. And these were given representative changes in climate variables such as temperature and rainfall and so on. And these were categorized by, first of all, global temperature rise, whether it's moderate or higher, and if they get a significant change in their atmospheric circulation and therefore the dominant weather patterns, whether that's low or high. And this can be really appealing because it's 4 simple cases to consider when you're thinking about the future of the Netherlands climate, and you can then look at the change in the physical variables associated with each one and work out what that means. I'll just switch back to this one. However, most projections produced nationally and internationally and for states and locally don't do this. What they do is they use the emissions pathways or emission scenarios for the framework for the climate projections, but then present a range of projected change for each of those cases. So this isn't a set of true scenarios because it's not a representative sampling of the physical possibilities into a defined set of narratives. And it produces ranges of change, not a representative value, and it produces series through time rather than a snapshot, a particular window at time, window in time where you end up at that scenario. I hope that distinction is clear, but we can maybe go over that again in questions and discussion later. Recently released was the Climate Measurement Standards Initiative guidance for private sector companies producing their task force on climate-related financial disclosures and providing some principles and guidance about how they might like to do that so that the disclosures they produce are comparable between each other, which makes them then more useful to things like regulators and investors and so on, so they can see the lay of the land. In part of that, we proposed a simple version of this kind of Dutch 2x2 kind of framework for Australia, and included for a lower warming and a higher warming case where, you know, on the one hand, transition risks are higher, physical risks are lower, but definitely not zero, and one where transition risks are lower and physical risk is much higher for the high climate change scenario. And then for each of those have a kind of a different level of warming and other impacts are possible for each of those cases. So we're hoping that that's a useful tool that some people will like to take up, and provided information about a representative climate model simulation that represents each of those 4 cases. And then assessed ranges of extreme events, changes to some types of climate extremes can be tied to each of those scenario cases. It's possible then, but hasn't been done in Australia and nowhere that I'm aware of. If you have a set of physical climate change scenarios that are usable and are practical and people like them and are using them, I mean, it would be then possible to add appropriate described stress tests that could go under each of those. So for example, if we did have a 2x2 set of scenarios here, you could define a set of compound climate extremes that really stress your system, and define that by each of these cases for each of these scenarios to kind of illustrate, well, what would a set of extreme events look like under that future scenario? What would a set of climate extremes look like under that one? And that could be a really useful tool for people to then understand, well, okay, yeah, what is a stressing case for each of these scenarios. It's important to realise that if you just produce one set of stress tests without first giving this the scenario context, then that could be potentially misleading, because you may not be able to get a particular stress test under each of these cases. One aspect of scenarios in general and the use of them is there's a kind of a balance between how tailored they are for a particular question and how comparable they are. So for example, you could produce very tailored scenarios for a particular question, which is a really useful tool for planning the future for that specific question and internal decision making, but that makes them then less comparable to other efforts. On the other hand, very general scenarios that kind of are widely used for different applications are then less useful for specific internal decision making, but are then of course more comparable to others. So an example might be, this is hypothetical off the top of my head, this may be way off in the details, so if you are a raspberry farmer, don't get angry at me. But this is, say you're the raspberry industry in Victoria and you have impacts from direct climate impacts, say changes to chill hours and how the fruit grows. You've got indirect climate factors such as pests, diseases, supply chain impacts, and then non-climate factors that will come into play in the future for your industry. To do a financial disclosure of your risk or to do internal decision making about sector planning, you might want to use scenarios and a scenario analysis. If you only want to cover internal industry decisions, you might want to use highly tailored scenarios specific to the thresholds, sensitivities, and questions that are relevant to the sector. So for example, the change in chill hours, the change in pest risk, etc. And you might have, say, a set of 4 scenarios that are useful for that. And I've kind of sketched out, again, hypothetically, on the right there, the scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, changes to growing conditions, changes to the markets, changes to pests, etc. And then those can be related directly to adaptation options you might want to implement, such as changes to marketing and supply chain, through to more intensive management, right up to just switching to other crops. If it's for, say, a disclosure of financial risk that's then going to be assessed and looked at by, say, investors and regulators, you might want to make that comparable to other things. So you might want to start with the top-down, set of climate scenarios that are consistent and comparable to other assessment, including the time frame, emissions pathways, and assess the changes to extremes that involves. This is then less useful internally because it's not tailored specifically to the questions you want to address, but it is more comparable externally. So a couple of terms just used there were bottom up and top down. So I think these are really crucial concepts when we come to looking at climate and climate risk. Top down starts with, what does the future global society look like? What are appropriate emission scenarios? What's the climate response to those scenarios, modeled through climate models, etc. And this is what we've been talking about above. For example, if you want to look at water management, you start with climate projections, you assess the impacts of those climate projections. This can inform strategic planning for water management. This is hampered by the kind of expanding window of uncertainty through projections, and it ends up typically with a wide envelope of possibilities. Different emission scenarios, different possibilities under each one, different local impacts that implies, and then and so on. To turn it on its head, the bottom-up approaches use start with the decision or management context. They bring in vulnerability and sensitivity analyses early on and look at what is possible to do in terms of management and what's most sensitive and what's most vulnerable. They apply adaptation principles such as what can we do that's low regrets first and foremost before doing things that are higher risk or higher possible regrets, and aim all decisions around robust decision-making frameworks. So for example, in water management, this means assess all the viable management options that are on the table, test sensitivities of your system, then prioritise options that are available that are robust to different climate and non-climate pathways, and then implement those, but then monitor them going forwards. And this is often a more appropriate approach if you've got a very focus on making specific decisions to manage risk. This is a slide from Michelle Ho at CSIRO Land and Water, illustrating this using this kind of vertical dimension of top-down, downscale different global climate models to regional scales, generate runoff time series, implement and design and implement adaptation decisions, whereas bottom-up is the reverse. You kind of start with define your system performance criteria, model the system response to climate variability, then do stress tests to identify bounds of sensitivity, and then look at assess plausibility of system failure under different cases. And here is where you bring in the plausible climate range at the end. And another way to describe that is a circle where you start by defining the problem, build a system model, do vulnerability analysis and stress tests, assess it, make a decision, and then go back around again. And here's where you bring in climate projections, and here's where you revise, review, assess, and then feed back to the decision making. And the references behind that are in the bottom. And again, this is from Michelle Ho. Some other really important terms used in climate and climate risk, climate projections are mitigation. You often hear this term, and it's used in the reference to mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases. But this can be confusing because there's also the general term of mitigating risk. And when you're talking about climate and climate risk, that's an obvious point of potential confusion. So when you're talking about mitigating emissions, which means reducing global emissions to reduce climate change and climate change impacts, compared to, in general, mitigating risk. There's also the term adaptation. This means making adjustments in ecological, social, economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. So that's a general term, but people can use it to mean different types of adjustments, or may have a preconceived notion of what type of adaptation they mean when they use that word. Another very commonly used word is resilience, and my understanding is this can refer to two aspects: the capacity to absorb stresses and also the ability to adapt, reorganise and evolve in response to stresses. However, I do know that some fields emphasise one or the other of those aspects of resilience, just the ability to absorb it or the ability to adapt, reorganise and evolve in response to it. So I think differences between different uses there is an issue. And the term bottom-up went through what, in a climate sense, people use that term for, but social scientists have a particular use for this, meaning it involves community engagement to develop and implement solutions. So involving, engagement and communication with the community especially, which isn't necessarily part of the general framework used in climate work. So through discussions, we kind of got a few suggestions for clarifying terms and being careful with our language, and that would be to use things like emissions pathways. So the RCPs are described as pathways, SSPs are now pathways. The term emissions scenarios has been commonly used through time. However, since it's got such a potential to be confused with other scenarios, how about we use the term emissions pathways? What do you think? Similarly, socioeconomic pathways, not scenarios. And then whenever you do use the word scenarios, we're perhaps suggesting, well, let's always use a descriptor or qualifier to the word. So for example, physical climate change scenarios like the KNMI ones, or stress test scenarios, if that's what they are. But be aware that some people say case study and some people just say stress tests. And whenever you're saying the word mitigation to mean emissions mitigations, you say that. Don't just say mitigation, because it can be confused with other terms like risk mitigation. So hopefully those are pretty common sense and agreed. But I think there's more work to be done to make sure we're on the same page about some of these concepts and words. So I guess that I'll stop there, but really put it open to, well, what are the terms are standard in your field, and where are the disparities between what I've just gone through, and where do we especially need to harmonise terms? Not standardise, not come in and tell people exactly what they should do and write some textbook, but at least harmonise so we each know what we're talking about when we use words like this. So hopefully that was interesting, and hopefully there's some discussion we can have now about anything in the talk, but specifically about terminology as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael. Simon would like to ask you something.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question or a comment or a discussion piece. Thank you. It was a nice talk, a nice overview of the confusions of language that we sometimes navigate, create, and communicate. So the one that really catches me is resilience and what this means, because I always thought of it as it's the recovery phase. You can't prove to be resilient until the bad thing happens to you, the extreme event or whatever. Whereas increasingly in political discourse now, it's offered in the other terms of becoming more resilient as a preparatory kind of action for something that may or may not happen. So I don't know if you want to go any further into that, but it certainly confuses me, the two uses of it, and I prefer the one where it's the recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have special knowledge on this topic in particular, but yeah, I totally agree that you measure how you recover from things. That's like one measure of resilience, but used as a kind of a like potential resilience, like, you know, you think you will be able to recover from shocks, you know, is I don't know, it's kind of hard to measure in a way, isn't it?
I think the physicists use it to some extent like that in terms of elasticity of a medium.
And I think it's, yeah, the other, just when I was doing some reading to build up to this is, yeah, not just absorb stresses, but also like adapt, reorganize, and evolve in response to stresses goes beyond what some people think of as resilience, totally. And I think, you know, that will be different in different cases, I think.
Thanks, Simon. Was that all?
That's all for now until the silence and
There's another question coming from Will Howard.
Yeah, hi all. Sorry, I'm looking at this on my iPhone because it wouldn't work on my computer. So I'm looking at a very small screen. But Michael, that was really great. I was really interested in the way you presented that sort of 4-quadrant view of life, but I kind of am concerned that it adds perhaps another level of confusion. Are you kind of presenting the idea that there would be 4 quadrants within a given, say, RCP type scenario, that the 4 corners of the quadrant would arise due to intermodal, variation in the response to that radiative forcing? Or are you saying you'd pick 4 different scenarios out of 4 different quadrants out of the different scenarios?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's really important to be clear about that. And there's no textbook about how to do this. I mean, there's certain practices that will be more defensible than others. For those cases, it was a mixture of the two. It was collapsing 2 dimensions of uncertainty into just 4 cases. So for the Dutch example, the low warming case is primarily to do with the emission scenario, whether it's low or high, gets you to that level of warming. But the change in kind of circulation and therefore rainfall and so on is a matter of the potential change in the physical system in response to emissions.
Right.
The 4 quadrants we did for the recommendations as a simple starting point for the CMSI guidelines, again, was low warming was a low emission scenario, high warming, high emission scenario, and then the 2 scenarios within each one to kind of bracket the range within each one. We thought that was a reasonable way to kind of break it down into by 2 dimensions, so that you don't, obviously people want 1. And if they can't have 1, maybe 2 would be useful, a low and a high. But we kind of think that there's no way to typify the response for each emission scenario into 1 single number, because there's such a range of possibilities. The future's hard to know. So at least by having 2, we can have at least 2 cases for each one. Yeah.
And there may be stress tests, just a comment, in which you put the terms of rainfall and temperature, but there may be situations in which, say, sea level might be more important. So
exactly, yeah. How you define what is the threat or what is the risk, it depends on your situation. I mean, some things are vaguely correlated. So, like temperature rise is generally correlated with a lot of things and a lot of impacts, but not completely and not tightly for some things. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay, also, Dylan would like to ask something.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great presentation. I guess on this last slide, this question about where we need to harmonise terms, the one that quite clearly sticks out in my mind is in this context is in the planning work by AEMO, whether that's integrated system plan or otherwise. And yeah, I assume you're relatively familiar with that work, but they come up with 5 narratives that are used in the electricity planning sector, in the national electricity market. And yeah, that strikes me as, I mean, in the consultation on the last, in the last ISP, that was a sort of point I tried to stress, is harmonising the the narratives of the ISP with the SSPs in particular. There didn't seem to be a lot of interest in that at the time, but there was certainly, I guess, a lot of awareness of the RCPs, but not so much the SSPs. So I guess I'd be interested to know, yeah, I guess what your thoughts are on that, and I guess actually how you might do that in practice because of the, I don't know, the slightly different, needs of the different communities, whether it's the, the national electricity market community or the climate modelling community. Yeah, I personally see a very strong need to standardise those or harmonise those at least, not necessarily, have a top-down approach, but at least have them talking to each other. But I'd be interested to hear how you think you might actually achieve that.
Totally. And just off the top of my head, I won't have all the answers at all, but I'll give you my thoughts. But yeah, there's just the heart of, I guess, what we're kind of getting at here is, where and when do the climate scenarios or the global emission scenarios that lead to climate change, where can they inform and how can they be consistent with more tailored, specific and useful scenarios for a given sector? And so that you, even if they're not flow directly out of the climate, because it's only one factor, at least you understand where and when they map onto each other is important, I think, because the climate and climate scenarios and also the emissions pathways that get you to those climate changes are internationally relevant and looked at, so that you need to understand how they connect. And yeah, I don't have a simple answer, but just, some kind of mapping of how the SSPs relate to these narratives. I should be really clear as well, SSPs are global. They don't have a lot of information for any individual country. They've got just broad statistics. So they need a bit of overlay or insight at a national level to know what they mean to Australia. And I think that work is still kind of needs to be done in general, and then what they mean for specific sectors like electricity. So for example, if we're following a sustainability SSP, that could be, the global context could be a lot of investment in certain types of energy and a reduction in other types of energy. The markets could be good and functioning, there's opportunities, etc. Compared to regional rivalry might be, there's international context of poor trade, less transfer of knowledge and intellectual property to improve energy networks, etc. Like it's important, interesting international context, and I think the climate change scenarios are also important and interesting climate change contexts as well. But they do need that overlay of, well, what does it mean specifically for us? So yeah, I'm kind of rambling a bit there, but yeah, no, I think it's an example right at the heart of this kind of connection that needs to be made.
It's, if you allow me a second, it's actually quite surprising how well, even though the scenarios were developed quite in parallel, it's actually interesting how well they do map up to the SSPs, particularly the, one scenario is essentially regional rivalry, because in the ISP, these narratives are about the global context, not specifically it's sort of, whether there's strong global action on climate change or there's regional rivalry. Without using those words, they actually do roughly map up quite well, except in a very accidental, at least it appears, accidental and not explicit way. But yeah, so.
No worries, and that sounds kind of positive. And there has been exercises in Australia in the recent past looking at scenarios of development and so on that weren't tied directly to climate scenarios. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think in this context and this day and age, I think any scenarios of the future have to have a climate component. It doesn't all have to flow from climate scenarios, but I think they need to have a climate component to them because it is going to be a fundamental driver of our future. And as part of that, they need to be mindful of the international situation that gets you to each of those climate scenarios. Yeah, but the balance will be different in different cases, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be anyone else in the chat, but if anyone else does want to speak, now's your opportunity.
Maybe I could have rambled a bit more about for each of these questions. I guess, well, maybe one thing I'd be interested in just getting a bit of quick feedback, since we've got some spare minutes, is, I mean, these suggestions seem quite common sense. Is everyone, would there be any reasons not to do some of these? Like, so for example, when we talk about emissions, let's move away from the term emissions scenarios and just talk about emissions pathways. And for example, whenever talking about mitigation, just make sure we always say emissions mitigation, if that's what we're talking about. Any objections to these kind of ideas? Maybe I should take no response as
Silence is golden,
agreement.
I think. Yeah.
And what about the term stress test or stress test scenario or case study? Is there some standardization or some kind of glossary? Definitions need to be clear in this area.
I don't know if I'm on mute or not. Can you hear me?
Can I hear you? Yes.
I was just going to suggest, well, a word that I think gets used in, at least in ISP and ESU kind of world, is sensitivity. I don't know to what extent they overlap, but certainly in my experience, you have your core scenarios and you do sensitivities around them, and that sort of sounds to the same, a similar terminology to stress test. So my only comment there would be that we might already have a word that we use.
That's an incredibly important point, and it's a huge gap in what I've got here is, yeah, sensitivity and sensitivity tests and sensitivity analyses. They get used in different ways. And just to add another kind of curveball at you, in climate terms, climate sensitivity has got a specific scientific meaning, which is defined as the rise in global average temperature when you double carbon dioxide. So when people start talking about climate sensitivity, they're not talking about the sensitivity of something on the ground to climate. They're talking about a specific climate sensitivity, climate term. So we've got to be careful about that one. But yeah, more broadly, I think sensitivity and sensitivity testing is incredibly important. And through the bottom-up kind of slides, that's a core part of that is, well, first of all, understand where your sensitivities are, where your thresholds are, and so on, and then you can make a more informed decision. But if people are using the term sensitivity differently, then that's possibly confusing too. But yeah, I think sensitivity is another term, and sensitivity testing and sensitivity analyses, kind of we need to get on the same page about.
Michael, it's Kaz here. I quite like the suggestion of the common language. My thing is always around the word resilience coming out of ecology. That's used in very specific ways too. I think some of those interpretations from ecology have been standardised in with climate science along the way as well. So yeah, I'll send you some stuff offline about that maybe.
Oh, thanks very much, Carolyn. Yeah, okay. Is it more the first one, just the ability to absorb stresses, or is it more include the second one, the kind of adaptation in a way as well to stresses that they use in ecology?
Definitely not the second. So because the second one is adaptation for us. So resilience in ecology is about you can withstand a press disturbance or pulse disturbance and recover back to a similar structure and function that you were before, and then you've got stepped levels above that. So adaptation is when you can't recover back to what you were, you start adapting, and then mitigation goes on as well. So and it's been a conversation in ecology for the 20 years I've sort of been looking at this stuff from my PhD, and I've got some quite clear thinking around it now.
Do you use the term from your day job in the hydro? I
Yeah.
guess your day job is ecology, isn't it? But like the other part of your day job in terms of power supply and water levels and stuff?
Yeah, we sort of do, and we sort of don't. Not so much resilience as adaptation and mitigation come in elsewhere in the language within our business. And some of the frameworks, well, the frameworks we've got around our water level management, linking the water level management to the ecological impacts are actually all inherently tied into the resilience thinking and the ability for an ecosystem to withstand a disturbance or not.
Yeah, I must say, I didn't look into this word that deeply. I just looked at a few definitions and kind of picked up one. And I was aware that it is a hot topic word.
Yeah, it's an awful one because as you've said, every different discipline has got its own interpretations to it.
I was also just, while we've got some more time, I was just thought, in terms of stress tests, I mean, I thought it was interesting that the Bank of England stress tests include a shock scenario and a longer term time frame stress test. In electricity, do you only use stress tests to mean, you know, short time window, set of extreme events, kind of shock tests? Or do people in their future planning think about, you know, stress tests meaning, you know, longer time window, chronic hazards, but that are very stressful as a stress test, or both?
So that's getting outside of anything that I've sort of got direct experience to when you're talking about how it's used in the electricity industry. So I'm going to go on mute and let others answer.
Maybe there's no common usage here. I don't know, but maybe it's something that it's just an ongoing conversation to move towards. Like, what's actually going to be the most useful thing there?
Well, there's also a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
If anyone wants to think of them. So Bastian's asked 2 questions. It says, how are you going to include this information in the current AEMO planning? Do you have any plan to include a new demand profile with different probability of exceedance?
So I'm very new to the ESCI project and I don't know all of the technical details, so someone else can answer that part. But just in terms of how we're going to kind of perhaps help in this regard about language and terminology was thinking whether a kind of a glossary and explainer of terms as part of the web page and reports, etc., would be useful. And if so, you know, working out how to get, you know, relevant and useful content for it. But in terms of those more specific questions, I'll have to throw that over to someone else. Is someone else on the call able to answer that?
I don't.
It's Mandy. Judith might be able to give us some indication. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Hi, is that Jill? Yeah, I'm happy to answer it specifically from the point of view of the ESCI project. For those of you on the call who don't know me, I'm the project coordinator for the Electricity Sector Climate Information Project. The definitions that Michael has been talking about are consistent with the ones that we're using in the ESCI project, and we're working with AEMO to use these definitions consistently in electricity sector planning as far as possible. Having said that, Michael has raised some subtleties about, for example, use of scenarios, which we can't claim to have pinned down exactly. But to answer, or at least to touch on Bastian's second question, AEMO already includes climate information in demand profile planning, and is also a partner in the ESCI project to specifically incorporate, with the goal of incorporating climate information in market modeling.
Michael, we just had a request if you could repeat the question. So could you repeat the question before those answers came up re-AEMO's planning?
Sure. Yeah, I can't remember the previous ones, but any other ones I'll repeat.
Sorry, I probably should have done that, Michael. So the questions I was answering was from Bastian, who said, how are you going to include this information in current AEMO planning? And do you have any plan to include a new demand profile with different probability of exceedance? So those of you who are attending can go to the interim ESCI website, which will include more detail on that. But the short answer is that yes, we are working with AEMO to include that information in their planning.
Oh, I think it was the question before the one that came up in the chat, Michael, the last one.
Oh, about resilience, maybe?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. Oh, hi, Jill. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm good, thank you, Michael.
Jill was my PhD supervisor, so there you go. Haven't seen you for ages.
Dylan, did you want to make another comment?
So I could be wrong, but I think Michael was asking a question about how we do stress testing in the electricity sector.
Yeah.
And so I think there's lots of different time horizons that are relevant. I guess on the planning timescale, planning horizon, we have the integrated system plan, which is goes out 20 years, and then there's the ESU, which was published a month or so back now, that goes out 10 years. And so in that, they very explicitly talk about scenarios with sensitivities, and in those sensitivities, there are things like, in this year in particular, it was sensitivities around what the impact of COVID might have been, or what industrial closures might happen, etc., with smelters. So there's sort of like broader scenarios that are underpin the sort of, I guess, the foundations of the different scenarios they're looking at, and then they do these sensitivities, as we call them, which I think seem to map to what you're talking about in terms of stress testing around that. And then they also do, I guess, much shorter term forecasting. So they do what's called the midterm projected adequacy system assessment, which I think is 2 years out. A smaller one, a shorter one, the short-term one that goes out about a week or two, and then there's different. There's even shorter term, half an hour, 2-day advance forecasts, and then 5 minutes, an hour ahead kind of forecasts. And they don't. I wouldn't call those sensitivities in that they. Well, I guess they do. They do sensitivities around I guess high load and low load scenarios in those, or sensitivities. But yeah, there's sort of lots of different timescales that are, I guess, relevant. But yeah, at least to my knowledge, it's not really referred to as stress testing, but more sort of a common. I think someone brought this up in the chat. This probability of exceedance is a common metric, which is essentially, a 1 in 2 year demand, or that's the 50% probability of exceedance, or the 1 in 10 year demand, so that they sort of have bounds of possible situations that are explored in those shorter term sort of outlooks. But yeah, I'm not aware of them being called stress tests, and they may be internally, but it's not a commonly heard term that I'm aware of.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, I guess it makes me think, there's the, starting from today going forward, there's the short-term forecast stress tests. Then there's the longer-term, like projection style, is out to 10 years. And then there's the possibility or the possible usefulness of short-term stress tests in the future. So if, say, a heat wave coming through in the year 2050, a plausible future climate scenario at a short, that could be described as a future stress test or something like that. That could be useful, but they're different time frame. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, we're pretty much out of time. So there's just one quick question, which is if you're willing to share your slides.
Yeah, sure. And nothing's it's all publicly available stuff. So yeah.
Okay, great. Since we're out of time, it brings us sort of to the end of today's webinar. And I'd really like to thank Michael for presenting today's webinar, and also to everyone who's attended for your time and your participation today. A recording of today's webinar will be made available on the ESCI page of the Climate Change in Australia website. If you have any questions about today's webinar or the ESCI project, please don't hesitate to contact us. My email address is in the webinar confirmation email. Make sure you look out for the next ESCI webinar. The details will be distributed shortly. So thanks again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next ESCI project webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.